Okay, well, welcome to the next section in our colonial, I want to say literature section here. It's all political writings, to be honest, with the exception of maybe one, and it's arguable still. So we're going to be looking at the Declaration of Independence today. Now, a lot of you might say, Mr. Morse, this is an English class, not a history class. Why are we looking at this? Well, early documents in the United States would lean more towards the political nature as as the United States was being formed. I mean, there's not a United States yet, but a lot of and some of the best writing was this political writing. The thing to remember is that you guys want to associate each individual class like it's its own little island. And all these islands make up maybe one big country, but each island is separate, and that's just not the case. Okay, all these disciplines overlap. You can even look at areas where like math and science can overlap with English and things like that. So this is all one big bucket of information. And a lot of the things we would talk about in literature, talk about techniques people would use, show up in history texts. They show up in the Bible classes. Mr. Morgan uses a lot of really strong English techniques because he's got an English degree. So a lot of this stuff overlaps. So if you can study things like this, you don't have to just study poems. You don't have to just study short stories. You can study things like the Declaration of Independence and still look at a lot of really important stuff. So my AP class right now is learning about a lot of this. So let me look at, we're going to be on page 110 for those of you following along at home. Page 110 of our textbook, and we want to start with these 4 appeals. I think it's 4. Yeah, I think this book uses 4. So we're going to talk about these 4 appeals, and we're going to constantly come back to these when we talk about nonfiction writing, particularly persuasive writing, okay? So let's look at these, because you do need to know these, all right? So our first one is an appeal to emotion. An appeal to emotion is what influences readers' feelings, is what your book says. But really that comes down to, a fancy term for it's pathos. But an appeal to emotion is when we look towards things like happiness or sadness. But the most common one, in my opinion, especially today, is fear. Politicians love that one. They love to appeal to your fear. My AP class showed a political ad that ran recently for a candidate who was talking about, people's desire to defund the police. And it showed this phone call, this poor lady calling, and it's saying like the police couldn't get to her right now, and it showed all this violence happening in the background. That is an appeal to emotions, 100% to fear, okay? I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's right either, by the way. But I'm just pointing to what it is, which is an appeal to emotions, okay? Our next one's an appeal to logic. This is just standard reasoning, the thing that most of us would use, using your statistics, facts, things like that. If you want the fancy term for it, it's logos, by the way. That one's easy to remember. And then we have appeal to ethics, which is to show that an argument is just or fair. Now, the person who used this book that I'm using wrote ethos next to it. That is not ethos, by the way, all right? Ethos is going to be the last one. This one does not have it doesn't fall into one of the 3 categories of the traditional, rhetorical types. So, appeal to ethics is really about showing that something is correct. It's right. When we use the Bible, we're using an appeal to ethics. Appeals to ethics are great if the audience you're using agrees with your ethical ruler, all right? Because to be honest with you, it's a mistake a lot of you make in your writing. You use the Bible when the audience is not Christians, and that kind of defeats itself. So that's one of the things we have to look at. So an appeal to ethics can be really strong if used in the right audience. Finally, we have appeal to authority, and this is where ethos actually is. I know ethics and ethos sound similar, but that's not what we go with. Appeal to authority is to show that a higher power supports the ideas. Now, let me be honest with you. When I say that this is ethos is when you establish your own credibility. So you show that yourself to be an authority, all right? So when you're appealing to another authority, that's not technically ethos, all right? That would be more like, quoting experts and things like that. But, I mean, it still is close. But really, ethos is about establishing your own credibility. Why should I listen to you? That sort of thing, okay? So in these 4 appeals, and we're going to see them all show up in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson uses all of these. So these are the things that help establish an argument as credible or not in the eyes of most readers. And yes, there are some tricks that people can use. Appealing to fear and for emotions. Emotions are a great thing to work short term. All right, an appeal to emotions is what happens usually with church. There's the an altar call or something is very much so an appeal, mainly an appeal to emotions. There's some other elements that go into it. And you see the same thing happen a lot. If any of you have been to a youth camp, you have this great speaker who has this powerful message, and tons of people come down front, and then 2 weeks later, these people have fallen back to their same old problems. And that's the issue with an appeal to emotions, is that you really have to. It has a great short-term impact. Long-term, it can be a little bit more tenuous. Okay. So, an appeal to logic. Logic works really well, but it's boring. It gets people to be, not as interested. You can really overdo it with an appeal to logic. An appeal to ethics already established depends on your audience. And finally, an appeal to authority depends on what people consider a higher authority. We all have different versions of how we approach authority. So all of these by themselves, if you use just one, are problematic. Okay, so a little bit about Thomas Jefferson there on page 111. Make sure you look at it. That is always fair game for a random test question. Okay, and the main things we're going to look at as far as from a literary angle on this, besides our 4 appeals, are diction and syntax. Okay, diction being word choice, the words they use. Syntax meaning how those words are organized. That's really how those two almost always go together, but they are very different things. Don't mix them up. All right. This work is overly formal in diction. It uses a lot of very fancy words. The syntax is problematic for a lot of people because it does use often long and inverted and complex sentences, so that can be really difficult for your average reader. So what this means for readers is slow down. Read this carefully, read it statement by statement, and make sure you understand what's happening before you go on. If you don't, be aware of what's slowing you down, all right, so that we can fix it. If you don't know, if you're just like, well, I couldn't follow it, that's not enough. Okay? All right. Let's start with the most famous part of this, the part that everyone knows. Okay? We're on page 112. He says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to this separation. Now, that's not the famous part, but the next paragraph is. So basically, the first paragraph here is just to establish when something drastic like this occurs, where we're going to secede from this country we belong to, that we're a colony of, we owe you a reason, and this is going to be that reason. All right. Of course, there again, you do see the very fancy diction and syntax, which again slows people down. But don't let it. Don't be intimidated. All right. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now look at the length of that sentence, first of all. It starts at the beginning of that paragraph and goes all the way to where I stopped. That was one big sentence. I wanted to make sure. That is a syntax thing that really throws people. But you guys all know the first part about we're endowed by our Creator. By the way, there's you an appeal to a higher authority, the reference to God, one of the most commonly used in this time period. The idea that God granted us these great, these rights, okay? Which means, if God gave it to me, you can't take it away, sort of thing. Now, these 3 things have caused us massive amounts of trouble because the definitions are these are, honestly, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all these involve level 2 words. So, life is pretty clear, but now we can get into really messy ground, which what do we mean by life? Do we mean just like physically being alive? Do we mean a quality of life? Do we mean, life before birth? There's so many messes with that. Liberty, what does liberty mean? It means freedom. Okay, what does freedom mean? Well, it means I can do what I want. Is that really what it means? Well, no. So we get into some definition issues there. And we've talked about the word happiness. My goodness, the word happiness is such a contentious word, and it's honestly a level 1 word. It has so little meaning at this point. So that obviously has caused us a lot of problems. But I think the big issue is that people don't read further. We stop with pursuit of happiness, but then we point out that it's the government's job to make sure we get those things. And what should we do when the government no longer is doing its job? Well, Jefferson's very clear that it's time for it to go bye-bye. Now, of course, at this time he's talking about the British government, but he also is referencing that that our own government needs to beware. But it also has to remember the fact that it's not it's not God, and that if it does not do its job, we have a duty as citizens to tell it get packing. Now, I'm not advocating that that's what we need to do now. I'm not going to wade into that mess, but I'm saying that, so many people are upset with things. Maybe, we need to look back at this document that everyone seems to love so much and look at what it actually says beyond just these are our rights. Okay. Continuing on, he says, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them to under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Now, tons of level 4 words in there, or, level 3 words, but we have words like, sorry, I just took my glasses off, now I can't see. You get words like usurpations, invariably, evinces, despotism. You get a lot of these higher level words, which again is a diction issue and throws a lot of you off, but you really don't have to. Okay, you can look up words and then re-examine it if that's your problem. And also remember that understanding every single word is not necessary. Jefferson's just pointing out here that governments that have been in place for a long time don't deserve to be kicked to the curb over the smallest things. All right, but and he's pointing that. He's basically saying that the British government's been around forever. So he's saying that these aren't small things. He's about to list the major things that have caused them to come to this conclusion that they have to break with Britain. But he's pointing out that it's the populace's duty to kick loose things that are not right. Okay, and that goes back to our previous statement. And again, I'm not trying to incite riot here, so I'm not going to continuously hammer home the Jefferson's point that when government doesn't work, government needs to go. All right, and that is something he definitely is saying here, and it's much clearer than life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, in my opinion. All right. Okay, he says, such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. There's a short sentence, finally, right? The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Now, after this, if you look, the rest of this, all are paragraphs that begin with he has, he has, he has. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, that's the repetition he uses. Repetition is a really key rhetorical strategy that allows you to, it basically hammers home an idea. It's not, I don't have just one example. I don't just have two examples. I have numerous examples. And by using the same phrase at the beginning, you really, hammer that home to readers. It's just like it's beating you over the head with a hammer, literally. It's not literally, metaphorically. That's what it feels like, okay? So he has a ton of things, some of them more glaring than others. One of the things we're going to do in class is talk about which of these really stick out as like today would still be really relevant, and which ones we would see as kind of, not a thing today that would really inflame people as much. So not the most interesting reading, by the way, but I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. Then it's going to make this video a little longer, by the way. I'm not concerned about if everyone watches this. I am concerned about my students who are doing at-home learning. This will help you since you're not in class when we read it there, okay? All right, so let's pick up right there in the middle with the first he has. And they start out kind of short, and they kind of build. The organization of these is important, and that's one of the brilliant things that Jefferson does do. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. So, that's just he's declined to, allow laws that work for the most of us, for the public good, which that's not what a ruler should do. All right, he has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. So he's micromanaging. He's like, you can't do anything unless I give you an okay, and he's dragging his feet on giving them an okay. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. Okay, so he's taking away their representation in legislature, which was a big deal. That one to me definitely sticks out as one of the red flags. Some of the other stuff, not so much, but that one definitely. You know, if you're going to be paying taxes, you have a right to have say so too. Okay. Notice that word tyrants coming up, or inversions of it. Tyranny earlier, tyrants now. That's a strong word. That is a level 3 word. It's a word that most of you know, but it has a very strong connotation. It says he has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. That's a dirty trick. You know, he's having meetings in places that are hard for people to get to so that they don't show up. It would be like scheduling a meeting about, something that your neighborhood's going to do that's going to be unpopular. So they schedule it on Wednesday at 2 a.m. In some random farm out in Baldwin County. It'd be like, nobody's going to show up. Good. Well, I can pass my rules then. It's a really dirty trick. Yes, politicians still use stuff like this. So he has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness, his invasions on the rights of the people. So he's getting rid of, legal bodies that have the right to say stuff. When they go against him, he just dissolves them. He fires people who disagree with him, basically. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He's saying he's also making it hard to refill these positions once he gets rid of these people or these bodies. And that causes, chaos, and it can cause damage to the system. Again, we see this all the time, too. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. I'm going to be really careful on that one, okay? I obviously slip into a little bit of political commentary myself here. That one is basically saying that the king's prevented people from immigrating to the U.S. and encouraging people. Now, don't yell at me. I realize different setting. At that time period, the country was new. It needed people. Now we're overcrowded and blah, blah, blah. Although overcrowded, I don't agree with. But I see the argument, okay? I'm just pointing to what is said here. So please, no one come after me with pitchforks. It says he has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. So he's preventing courts from being formed. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their office and the amount and payment of their salaries. Now, that one's a big one for me personally. And it's one of the great things that our country did do with the Supreme Court and a lot of courts. The idea is that the Supreme Court is not dependent. This is one of the things that I think a lot of people forget. We're in the midst of a really contentious time right now as we're looking at having a new Supreme Court justice perhaps nominated this week. And people think, okay, well, if a conservative or a liberal goes in, they're always going to vote that way. Guys, they don't have to, okay? And they don't have any, their jobs are not dependent on what they do. You could get a super liberal judge in there who could immediately turn and vote conservative on everything and go right with everything. By right, I mean to the right, not correct, okay? Go to the right on everything. And there's no punishment for that, okay? And these justices, once they get in there, very often will have surprising rulings. The president's had to deal with that with a couple of things recently, where conservative justices voted, or either abstained or voted more, not abstained. Either they voted a little bit more moderately, or their wording on their reasoning was more moderate. Let me say it that way. You can't vote moderate. You vote yay or nay. Or they even voted more with the more liberal ideas, and that's shocking to people. But the fact is that they're not dependent on their jobs as far as, if the president gets mad, he can't fire the Supreme Court. That's not going to happen. And they don't have to run for re-election. So our courts now are protected from this very thing we just saw, where the king was like, if you don't rule in favor of me, you're not going to have a job, or I'm just not going to pay you. So they didn't have a choice then. Our Supreme Courts, now not some positions are elected, Supreme Court is not, okay? It says he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Substance. So he's got a bunch of middlemen there to just gum things up. He is kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislature. That's a big one. Okay. In fact, that's probably the most well-known out of all these, in my opinion. That's the idea that the king has got an army there for no good reason. And he says, we're not at war. Why is your army here? And that's definitely a thing to consider. He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. So he's put the military above everything else and kind of made them above the law. And that's definitely a problem. Now, again, that's his military, not, the militias. This is a big one. It says he has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretend legislation, for courting large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond the seas to be tried for pretend offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. Now, a lot of things just like bang, 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 bang in there. There's repetition within that paragraph as he says, we got that semicolon, and then for blank, for blank, for blank, and he keeps using the semicolon to separate them. Again, that's repetition, and it's just a info dump here. So he just gives us a bunch of stuff that King has done that are well known. This paragraph has a lot of the things that he was known for doing that you study in your history classes. Here's the thing, guys. 2 or 3 of these are enough to really have a problem. Jefferson's not giving 2 or 3, though. He wants the whole world. And let's just be honest. This document, it was not just for the British people or for the British king to see. This is why we're leaving. This document was for the world to see that we had reason and that we were in the right in this argument. And based on these arguments, he's probably, spot on. Now, I'm sure the English king could have easily responded to most of these with his reasons, but I don't know if they would have held up as strong as the complaints, okay? A little bit more. It says he has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. By the way, do you notice the increasing violence that we have? Our very first thing, remember, was he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Now he's murdering his own citizens. And you see, we've built in intensity. And that big paragraph that we did with all the for this, for that is the separating point between these aren't minor, but these gripes, and now we're getting to the major stuff. Every one of these next few by themselves are enough to say we're done. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. Now, notice the very charged words in here. We have words like tyranny shows up again, cruelty, perfidy, barbarous. Then he compares it with what a civilized nation would do. So he's basically calling the king a barbarian. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So I've read 2 together there, I'm sorry. He talks about conscription, where they would capture a boat and they would make those guys serve as sailors and fight. If you didn't fight, they would kill you. So now you're being forced to fight against your own people, which is just such a dirty thing to do to people. Just make them prisoners. Why insist that they fight against their own people? That's horrible. And then that he's inciting revolt among the colonies, particularly with the Indians. Not my favorite part of the Declaration of Independence, but I realize that I can't put 2020 on 1770s. I can't put our sensibilities. When Jefferson calls the Indian savages, the stereotypes them as the way he does, that's kind of a crappy thing to do. But, they also okayed slavery still. So that, well, let's just say they weren't perfect, right? Definitely far from it, despite what you may read. All right, he says, in every stage of these oppressions, we have... Now, here's where we get a change, by the way. Notice this one doesn't start with he has. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. So he points out here that we have tried multiple times to go about this the peaceful route, and it's been shot down every time. It says, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Now we have been wanting the attention of our British brethren. We have warned them, we have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war and peace friends. So that's a reference to the not only the people in England, but also to the loyalists. I feel like that's a message to them, the ones who are still in America, who are still loyal to Britain. He's basically saying, in war we're enemies. In peacetime we can get back to being friends, but we've asked for your help, and we've tried to explain this to you, and you also are not listening to us. Okay, closing out, he says, we therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. By the way, Supreme Judge of the world, that's your other appeal to a higher authority, that's God he's referencing. The rectitude of our intentions, do in the name of the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. They are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Now, that's a huge part. That's your appealing to logic. Now, by the way, all of this has been in a lot of ways. He's saying, this is wrong because of this, and he's giving you like concrete reasons. But right there, he's establishing that, here's the pattern. Here's why we should be free. He's summing it up here, really. Here's why we should be free. Here is the result of our freedom. That's all a logical progression. All right, and last paragraph. And for the support of this declaration, with firm reliance on our protection of our divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So, at this point, there's a lot more to the Declaration of Independence than life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I hope is what you've understood, okay? I would like you to take a look at all of he has statements and figure out which one you think is the most convincing, which one today, which would be the most convincing, and which is the least convincing in your opinion, all right? We want to look at these. Now, by the way, they're all powerful. None of them are bad by any stretch. Even as I look at them again for like the fifth, sixth time here in the last few days, they all have a point, but which one really sticks out is, for today's audience, which one would really, stick out. I also like you to look at how, our own government in some ways, and I'm not just talking about the current administration. We can back up years and years and years and see some of these same abuses, how it doesn't hold up with some of these things. It's some of the things that the king's being convicted of we see happening now, all right? And I want you to look at that, and what should we do about that? How do we handle that situation? Make sure you can identify all four appeals. I've given you, I think I didn't mention any appeals to emotion, but if you can't figure those out, I don't know what to tell you. There's plenty in there, all right? I also want you to think about, and this is on your weekly agenda, I have the question about how does Jefferson integrate the ideas of logic and faith into his document? Because he does use reasoning and faith. They're both in there. For some reason today we struggle with that. I want you to think about how Jefferson does it and why it's so tough for us today, because that is going to be on your test. I'm just giving you a heads up. Any of these things in here that I'm like, hey, take a look at this, pay attention to that, and then there's not an assignment, as like today, there's no assignment listed. You got to understand that is probably going to be something you're going to see on a test at that point, okay? All right, guys. Well, that gets us through this. I do apologize that there were some points in this where I may have wandered a little bit into political territory and made some snarkier comments. I know my several times I'll say things that can be construed negatively. And I want you guys to understand that, like you, I'm a person. I have the right to my opinions. I'm not trying to advocate for either side in our political issues, and I don't expect you to agree with me. You are not going to be penalized for having different opinions than me in any way, shape, or form, okay? I want you to understand that. My room's a safe spot, and just because we may not agree politically doesn't mean we can't get along. So I hope this was useful. I hope for a lot of you, maybe this is the first time you've even looked at the Declaration of Independence, and now you know what it's really about. You also know it's not the Bill of Rights, which is constantly confused. It's not the Constitution. There's several documents that are of great importance to our country, country. This one is really just about saying, okay, we're not part of Britain anymore, and here's why. Okay, and that's what this one was. This was declaring the independence, and at this point, it's not establishing the United States. It's basically just saying we're independent states. Each place was its own country at this point, to be honest with you. All right, we're just a loose grouping at this point. All right, guys, well, I'm going to stop there because the video is definitely at 30 minutes. It's a little bit difficult when I read the whole thing, but I feel like sometimes that's necessary, all right? So I hope this was helpful, and I hope you guys have an amazing rest of your day.